Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Blueprints for Freedom, your favorite podcast where we talk about all of the landmines that we have stepped in organizing and the different things that we have learned over the years so you don't have to.
Nicely done. Well said.
I am your co host, Alyssa Marie, and this is my co host.
Timo.
Uh,
Right.
today,
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. No, I was just going to say today's episode, I'm really excited for. I think Alyssa and I have been wanting to have this conversation for a while on the show. But I would love and I'm excited for y'all to be a part of this more intimate conversation and would love to hear your thoughts and comments. So please feel free to drop something in the chat, whether you're on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. We want to hear from all y'all. We want y'all to be a part of this conversation. We love hearing from y'all and adding what you're asking or what you're saying into the conversation. So please feel free to do that.
make sure to like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. Follow us and like if you're on Instagram, and follow and like on Facebook as well.
Yeah.
We thank you all so much for your support. Today's conversation is around the foundations of power, why organizational health determines movement success, right? Oftentimes we see um, organizational health as separately from our movements, and this conversation is rooted in the fact that the two are just as equally important and deserve the same amount of attention. So today we'll be diving into something most movement spaces avoid, what's really going on inside our organizations and why it matters for winning. Because the foundations of our power, because if the foundations of our organizations are fragile and they're not built on care, accountability, and sustainability, we will continue to fail.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times, right, not only the organizational health, but even just like relational health, which does speak to the organizational health because organizations are made up of people, right? And so if we don't know how to be in good relationships with folks, if we are just trying to jump into the work without building some type of foundation for that work, and we've seen it on the ground. I'm pretty sure some of y'all who are in this work on the ground in different areas, like this is a reoccurring issue.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think what's important to understand is that when we're talking about organizational health, we're talking about the culture within our
Mhm.
organizations, we're talking about the values of our organizations,
Yeah.
we're talking about the interpersonal relationships within our organizations.
Hmm.
But we're also talking about our uh, board books. We're also talking about our
Hmm.
personnel books. We're talking about our personnel policies. We're also
Hmm.
talking about our budgets and how our budgets are statements of our values. So
Absolutely.
it goes and really involves everything on an administrative level for
Hmm.
nonprofits, right? But I think our internal structures are a reflection of what we say our values are. And
Yeah.
sometimes as nonprofits, we tend to get so caught in what the funder wants, whatever institutions we're
Hmm.
partnering want, and we tend to often at times shy away from our values. And then we start to see the disconnect between our values and our
Hmm.
practices within our organizations.
Yeah. And I think it's really important when you're talking about the organizational health that it's not just something that's written down on paper, right? We have to practice what we preach. We have to walk the talk as well, right? Like as you're listing all of the things around like what organizational health actually looks like, what's coming to me is like, how does that actually manifest in real life, right? Like, how do we actually act that out day to day, right? Like when we say, hey, our values, one of our values is accountability. So, how we show up in accountability, do the leaders in that organization allow folks who are members, right? Whether they be young folks or adults, whatever, however they may be, are they able to hold their folks accountable? Like, what are the mechanisms in place that allow that? But also, like to what you were saying earlier, right, around the administration as well, right? Like we say, like accountability and transparency, but I know we've struggled with this before, right? Like writing everything down, right? Because if we don't have anything to be held accountable to or be transparent with, right, then we're just saying things and we're not actually doing the things. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of name that because I'm like, a lot of these things are just they're ideas. So it's like, how do they actually how do you do that in praxis? Oh, you can see my cat in the background. That is so cool.
That's why I instantly smiled. I love cat pop-ups.
That is hilarious.
But I think the other thing is we have to be careful that within our own organizations and within our own structures, we aren't replicating the very same systems that
Mhm.
we're looking to dismantle, right?
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes we talk about like really just honoring the people within our organizations and making space for folks and so on and so forth. But
Mhm.
we don't realize the ways in which we push folks to burnout. We
Mhm.
don't realize in which sometimes we create cultures of martyrdom within our organizations,
Mhm.
right? Cultures of overworking folks, of underpaying folks, right? So I think
Mhm.
the other piece to it is from
Yeah.
like a human resource perspective, it is important that we're creating work environments within our organizations that honor our staff and our community members and our partners as
Mhm.
whole humans, right? That we're paying livable wages for the areas in which our community and our staff is living in. That
Right.
I think the other piece to it is like it is not the organization's job to meet every need of its staff and its
Yeah.
employees, but it's important that we create cultures of care within our organizations, right? And again, it doesn't mean that you're meeting every need, but it could
Yeah.
be as simple as having a staff wellness fund that your staff could access. It could be as simple as a yearly retreat for your staff and
Mhm.
making sure that you're separating time throughout the year for your staff to actually wind down and
Yeah.
do some relationship building together.
Mhm.
um, because the work continues and it will always continue. But if we don't take time to rest, if we don't take time to be in community, if
Mhm.
we don't take time to recharge, right, what ends up happening is that we have this constant turnover cycle within our
Mhm.
organizations where we have folks for 2 3 years and they're
Mhm.
really overworked those 2 3 years and disappear, right?
Yeah. Like I want to just sit there for a second, right? Because when you're talking about paying folks a livable wage, I think there's this stigma, especially in organizing work. Like I know when I got when I first started entering in like the nonprofit work in the service field, I was told by in an interview, they're like, you're not going to make a lot of money doing this kind of work. And I was just like, yeah, I know. And I like just took it as I knew what I was getting myself into, right? And as time progressed, I realized I'm like, no, the people who are doing the people work, the people who are serving community, the people who are uplifting community, the people who are building community, the people who are showing up when politicians aren't showing up, when the systems aren't showing up. It's those folks, right, that are running the organizations, that are providing the services, that are there when you call at 1 o'clock in the morning because your lights out and you have no food and like all these different things. And but yet these are the folks that get paid the least. And there's the stigma that you can't make a lot of money helping people. And it's like, especially for liberation organizations, that their goal is system change and liberation. And it's like, do we not think that the folks that are running this should also have a livable wage, should also be making money, should also be able to take vacations, have disposable income? And especially for Black and Brown folk and poor folk, I think when we think about working class people in general, we have this idea around how much money we should be making, how much money we should be spending on self care. What does rest actually look like versus being lazy? And when I think about like the 1%, I'm like, they don't work as much. Like they know how to take care of themselves, right? And so even culturally, I think organizations really can, to your point, right? Like having wellness funds and even funders, right? We've seen it where funders are creating grants for wellness and rest, which is definitely needed because this is not a regular 9 to 5. right? We're not just clocking in and clocking out. We are bringing our whole selves, our whole human selves, our emotions, our feelings, our history, our future to this work. And that takes a lot of energy. And not only does it take a lot of energy out of us, but when we think about when we go back home to our families, what have we given to the job that we're not able to give to our family? And for me, that's where the burnout really comes in, where it's like, if you are someone, if you're doing this work well, right? You're someone who's directly impacted by the work that you're doing, right? You are being transformed by the work you are doing. And so that there's a lot that you're giving of yourself that when you go home, yes, you're giving of yourself as well. But if you didn't have to give all of that at work, and at home and in your free time, right, the burnout wouldn't be happening as much.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think the other thing when it comes to leadership development, especially within like member organizations that are
Mhm.
doing movement work, what we tend to see is for the sake of numbers, for the sake of data to have to
Mhm.
provide to funders, we see a lot of folks get pushed through these leadership pipelines
Yeah.
rather quickly without taking the time to actually be fully developed. And then they get into leadership and are expected to show up in ways in which they've never been trained to show up in, right?
Yeah.
And now they are constantly burnt out because they're doing work that they're not sure they know exactly how to do because they haven't been trained or provided the skills to do so,
Mhm.
right? And then on top of that, are constantly being forced to be in the front lines when they're just not everyone wants to be the person on the bullhorn, right? And I think
Yeah.
we have to understand that within our movements, there's different roles for folks to play,
Yeah.
right? And not everyone will be at the front yelling at every action, right? There are
Mhm.
folks who are simply the ones that are doing the calls in the office to make sure that people show up. There are
Mhm.
folks that are simply the ones cooking for the actions to make sure that people are fed. There are
Yeah.
folks that are the ones opening their homes to be daycares to watch folks while folks are out organizing, right? So not everyone is meant to be in the front, and we tend to want to push everyone to the front, which
Yeah.
also continues to create this cycle of turnover because then instead of tapping into the skills that people already have, right,
Mhm.
and making them comfortable within this work, what we're really doing is pushing people out.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think about the internal conversation that we had about like the leadership pipeline versus membership pipeline. And especially with youth organizing, I think we speak in terms of leadership pipeline a lot. And we need to be doing both, right? Like how are folks going to engage in this work and not always having to be in the front? And everyone, I think most people have the capacity to know that something is wrong, right? When things are not going well, we can kind of feel it, whether people are like, oh, I feel it in my bones, or it's their intuition, right? We all have different sayings for that. But not everybody has the solution. And even those who may have the solution, not all of those who have the solution have the capacity or the skill set to build, right? And thinking about folks that know how to reimagine whole systems and folks who know how to edit those systems, right? We all have our own giftings. And I think it's important for us not only to walk in those giftings, but also know where our limitations are.
Yeah, I think the other like most important thing is that like when we as organizations are in dysfunction, right, our organizing strategies are gonna fail, right?
Hmm.
We aren't going to be successfully building membership. We're not going to successfully be building leaders. We're not going to successfully run campaigns because there is clear dysfunction that will disorganize us every single time, right?
Yeah.
And the other piece to that is that oftentimes we believe members can't tell what's going on,
Mhm.
community can tell what's going on. And the thing is, folks know. Folks can see it, whether it's spoken or unspoken.
Yeah.
Folks are paying attention, right?
Mhm.
And when there's this constant stage of dysfunction, folks will disengage from the work, right? So
Yeah.
we, as organization leaders, need to make sure that we are maintaining the health of our organizations
Mhm.
because whatever the specifics are, whatever the dysfunction is, the results are always the same An organization that cannot sustain itself cannot sustain a movement.
Yeah, yeah. And I also think organizations that have a hard time sustaining themselves have a hard time being in good coalition spaces with other organizations. I think back to some spaces that we've been in, right? And when you don't have and you're not fully able to show up as an organization, then sometimes the work ends up being more on one person than the other. And that creates more unhealthiness in the ecosystem, right? And there's more negativity that shows up. And so it prevents folks from really being able to organize again together. And also being able to, I think about even when leadership turns over, we've had examples of like, even in organizations, when there's leadership turnover, there's still things that are getting held on that is unhealthy and that is negative, that directly impacts the ability to do the work in this landscape period.
Mhm. I think oftentimes we tend to set up our structures for a lot of short-term wins. And the
Yeah.
reality is that we need to build our structures that allow for long-term sustainability, right?
Hmm.
We know that the work of system changing isn't something that happens overnight. It is not a 2-year, 3-year thing, but we're talking about 5 to 10 year strategies, right? That
Hmm.
require some type of sustainability and
Yeah.
structure, right, to be able to move forward successfully, right? And instead of viewing internal operations as separate from movement building, we must recognize them as integral to it.
Yeah, I think about the Republican strategy around Roe v. Wade, right? Like that was not a 5-year strategy or 10-year strategy, right? Like that was decades in the making. And even though folks were not always in lock and step and had disagreements, it was like we're gonna deal with that internally, but externally, we all on the same page. But a lot of the wins that we want and that we need, right? System change wins, they're gonna take time. But that also means that there might be some losses in the middle of that. And how do we sustain our community and sustain our relationship even when we lose? Or
Mhm.
even when we thought we were gonna have a win in 2 years, but it took us like 15 years.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, just like we as people don't just want to survive, we want to thrive. We want the same
Yes.
thing for our organizations, right? Because when we talk about organizing ourselves out of a job, right, meaning that we aren't here to do this work for the rest of our life, but the reality is that we're here to do the true work of system change that will
Yeah.
allow our organizations to no longer have a need to exist, right? And part of that is the ability to build with intention, right? Our internal systems as organizations, right?
Mhm.
That match that external impact that we're looking for, right? And creating organizations that don't just survive, but thrive, right?
Yeah. But I think that also a lot of what we're talking about, it's really, as you're talking, I'm like, yes, this is organizational, but this is also personal.
It's people work.
Because yeah, it's really people work, because when you're thinking about thriving versus surviving, that's a mentality. And I think that a lot of folks that look like us, that come from where we come from, we're constantly trying to survive. We don't even know what thriving really feels like. What does that look like? And I know amongst our organizations and a lot of other folks have visioning sessions, right? So we can imagine what that looks like. And then I think that and it's not to say that there aren't folks that look like us that are not thriving, right? Um, but the folks that are working in nonprofit work, that are in the trenches with us, like we may be thriving spiritually in community, or we may be thriving financially but not spiritual. Like I feel like there's this lack in some area, right? I think about something, what's his name, Trevor Noah had said, and he's from South Africa, and he was talking about the developed world and how like we think about like, oh, when you're like that's the best and you have everything you need, and they're like, what's the cost? And it's like the relationships, the community, that's the cost. And I think about, we, like you were saying, right, we used to have people in community that will watch the babies, right, while folks are trying to get stuff done and going to work, and then we got a system for that. now those relationships are no longer there. And so where we once were never really financially thriving, but we may have been spiritually thriving and relationally thriving, I feel like those things are still missing. And so because we've kind of lost how to do that, because we've allowed government to kind of come step in and take over and we got care for kids now. You don't need grandma in a neighborhood to take care of the kids and the babies, and it keeps them young too, and all of the cyclical effects and impacts of that. It's hard to then talk about how do we have that organizational long-term relationship, um, when you don't have a point of reference even in your own personal life.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
And I think I think there's been pockets formed, right? Where folks feel like they have community and have their chosen family, and have started to build these little pockets of community where they're thriving and living. Um, However, I want to see that for everyone. Like I want to see a communal thing, like not just for the folks that are part of this community, but for everyone.
Mhm. I think one of the other sort of like bigger pieces around healthy organizational cultures is how we deal with accountability and conflict, right?
Yes.
And understanding that these two things are always going to show up, whether
Mhm.
we like it or not. And we're
Oh
going to
yeah.
have to figure out as a community how do we deal with these things, right? Both internally as
Hmm.
organizations and externally with partners and community members, right? And this is the ways in which we begin to practice a lot of the stuff that we say we believe in around abolition of
Yeah.
policing, so on and so forth, right? And how we deal with conflict and accountability is a direct reflection of our values as organizations, right? Um,
Absolutely.
and I think oftentimes because uh, I'll move us away from like grassroots organizations who tend to not have HR departments, right? But when we talk about organizations that do have HR departments, right,
Hmm.
we need actual HR departments that center the people versus protecting the organization,
Yeah.
right? And I think oftentimes what we see is HR departments that are really the human resources for the organizations and not necessarily for the employees, right?
Yeah.
So how do we create and rebuild sort of this people culture within our organization that is about protecting the people and not necessarily the special interests of the
Yeah.
organization.
Yeah, no, and I think what you said is really true, right? Like how you deal with conflict internally and externally really speaks to the values of not only the organizations, but the leadership of that organization. Like as some folks might know, like we've been changing and switching up our board. And so like that's really been coming up for me around like, okay, who are the individuals on the board that will hold this accountable and say, like what you're saying, right? HR is for the people, but you need leadership kind of thinking about that accountability piece, right? That will actually hold true and stand true to that. Because let's be real, all these organizations, we are building systems like these, right? And we are fighting against systems, but we also need to be good builders of systems as well. And so how we build these internal systems will also reflect, to your point, right? Like this kind of whole conversation. If we can't build good internal systems, who are we to build new systems for our country, for one another, for our community, that are going to serve people the way that people need to be served? The
Mhm,
the the um what am I trying to I'm like the petri dish, right? But like the training ground is internal,
mhm.
and,
Yeah,
and I think about the conflict piece, like a lot of folks want to run away from conflict. I know I'm one of them folks that is conflict avoidance, but
same.
conflict is not always bad. Conflict allows us to see the true nature of an individual or an organization,
Mhm,
right? Because it's easy to be good when it's easy, but
mhm,
when it's harder, that's when the values really step in, right? And we have to be able to speak truth to power, right? This is something that we literally teach, right? We're teaching young folks and community members to go to the legislators who hold the power and speak their truth to them, right? But if we can't even speak truth to our own leadership internally, how are we then teaching others to speak truth? This the hypocrisy, and we see it and we walk in it and we live in it. But yet, I don't know, but yet we function and still it's crazy.
No, I'll share something personal. Me and Timo have been able to develop such a strong relationship in this work because of we've been able to hold each other accountable, right?
Hmm.
These two folks on the screen don't always agree. We will engage with each other in principled struggle,
Yeah.
right? There is a clear way in which we both handle conflict with each other, right? And it's a mutual agreement of like, this is how we're going to do it, right?
Yeah.
And there's multiple sort of checkpoints for us around how we're handling conflict amongst each other. But it is something that is a muscle that has to be built, right? It is something that takes practice and it takes time. But if we aren't taking the time to actually develop that muscle, we're failing, right? I think
Yeah.
the other thing for me is that, like, the tricky thing about organizational health is that it's often work that's invisible until it's
Yeah.
right. Unlike mass mobilization or viral digital campaigns, the internal work of keeping an organization functional rarely gets the public recognition, right? We're talking
Yeah.
about it is often one of the most critical and labor intensive aspects of movement work and is often what we least talk about, right?
Mhm.
And that's around building strong internal structures, building structures around accountability and conflict resolution, sustainable work cultures, and trust and relationship building because organizing is heavily relational work, right? Um, but I think that's why it's like the other piece around leadership development that we were talking about. Like, it's easy to mobilize
Mhm.
5,000, 7,000 people,
Yeah.
right? But what this is calling us to do is to build the structures to sustain the leadership development of those 5 to 7,000 people, right? It's
Exactly.
not just about how we're mobilizing folks. It is about the cultures in which we are building these folks to become the next generation of leaders,
Yeah.
that will continue to advance the social justice work that is required.
Yeah. Um, and I think what that also means is that redefining what success looks like,
Mhm.
right? What are the bars that we're setting for folks? What are we teaching folks? What does success actually look like? I think we've, even in organizing spaces where we try to decolonize ourselves, again, it's like, what's our point of reference? What like what did it look like before all of these structures of white supremacy were put into place, right?
Mhm.
And even when we think about time structures and we think about how we structure our meetings and having agendas, or what does success looks like when folks show up or don't show up. Like, I know we've had events, same events, where like 15 people showed up. It was a big group, it was robust, we were dope. And then same event, 4 people show up next time, but it was the right 4 people, right?
Mhm.
Both of those things are successful, but if we're constantly going for the numbers and not the quality, and it's all about the quantity, what are we going after? If we're always like, hey, we need to have an action of 5,000 people, but yet we've not contacted any of them. We haven't pulled any of them into the long-term work. Like, they just disappeared. Is that success? Or if we have an action and 15 folks show up on the street and we all out there screaming and marching, and afterwards we all go to the office, we breaking bread together, and 3 weeks later we still breaking bread together, we're strategizing. To me, that I'd rather have that
Mhm.
than the other, right? Than the quantity. Um, but our funders funding that, right? When you think about like, are our funders asking, we want the numbers, so we need quantity, but they're not even looking for quality. And so then that becomes that juggle, right? Like, as we're developing and building out these healthy organizations need robust funding. And we cannot, and I cannot stress this enough, we cannot continue to rely on philanthropy. We cannot continue to rely on the random generosity of the 1%, when it's really not generosity, it's a tax shelter. we need to be organizing and crowdfunding amongst ourselves, because we are the ones that will be directly impacted by the change that we're trying to make. We are trying to take power away from the folks who are funding this work. Like, think about that. Like, it's really crazy. Like, why would they fund their own demise, right? As much money throughout the generations that have been funneled through philanthropy and foundations, you would think that things would be solved, but they're not. And so that means it's up to us, the ones that are doing this work, to not only organize on the ground, but also to organize our foundations and organize money, right? Organize people to show up. And if you can't show up, give $5, give $10, right? I think we think about, and to me, it's the similar thing of, right, like success, because if I'm someone who knows that there's something that is wrong, but I don't know how to help, give. If you can't show up in your time, give. If you can't show up for a training, you can't cook, you can't wash nobody, baby, give. Because it will not be funded by our oppressors.
Mm-hmm. Which, by the way, if you haven't, make sure to stop by the new Citywide Youth Coalition website and check that out. And also go head on over to the donation page where you can make a lovely donation. Support the work at the Citywide Youth Coalition.
I'm all about that micro donations over here.
But as we get ready to close out, as we near 7, just want to take a moment to share some final thoughts and talk about what's ahead for Citywide, what you could look forward to. But I think for my final thoughts, I think the part I want to stress the most, right, is that while this work could often feel like it's an afterthought, and specifically talking about the sustainability of our organizations, health of our organizations, while oftentimes that work can feel like an afterthought, I promise you that the sooner you deal with things, the sooner that you build the structures, the sooner that you build the cultures necessary to run our organizations, the better, right?
Yeah.
Because figuring it out later down the road makes it even more complicated, even more hard, because now you're having to unlearn so much of a culture that you were used to within an organization, right? And having to relearn and practice this new culture. So I recommend for folks that are starting out to figure those things out at the beginning, right? And to make those a priority, right? And for those of us who've been in the work, there's always time to slow down, take a pause, and do the internal health work necessary for your organizations. Because, again, we're here for the long run, right? And just like folks on the other side have had 40 and 50-year strategies, we're building the same, right? And we know that the work that is requires our organizations to be built to sustain long-term movements and not just short-term wins.
Yo, that was well said. I feel like my final thoughts are your final thoughts.
Listen,
but I do just want to mention, y'all, if y'all didn't notice this background, it's a really dope background. Hold on, let me move. Oh no. So this is one side of our office, y'all. So just want to invite y'all into this space with us for a second and really look at, this is our office side, and on the other, we're like the little, what is that, like a doorway? That's our Black and Brown Power Center. This is a dope space. If you are local and in New Haven, please feel free to stop by and say hi, right? We do rent the Black and Brown Power Space. So if folks need a space to organize, if you have a nonprofit or you just want to get a group of community members together just to talk about what's going on in community, or you want to talk about racism, you want to talk about Trump, you want to talk about Elliker, anything, right? Please hit us up, shoot us a DM. on our Instagram. Let us know if you would love to collaborate with us. Come check out the space. We are in the throes of Abolition Boot Camp right now, which is our 6-week intensive for our young folks. So that is in the works. If you are local, please join us for Dinner and Dialogue. We just had a dinner and dialogue around mental health. It's usually once a month on the third Friday of the month. Please check out our Instagram page to stay up on top of that. We love having you in this space, but we would love to have you IRL and really to continue these really dope conversations, right, around not only internalized organizing health, but we've talked about Trans Day of Visibility, mental health, like all the topics. And if there's something that you're like, hey, I really want y'all to cover this, or some questions that you've had around your organizing work where you're at, please shoot us a message. We would love to either bring you onto the show and have the conversation with us, or we'd be willing to bring up that topic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And some resources for folks. You can always check out the NAP Ministry here on Instagram. Also recommend Beyond Survival, Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement, which is a really dope book. And then there's also the Combahee River Collective Statement, which is a really amazing and dope read. And the final line is, when we heal our structures, we free our strategies. Liberation isn't just what we demand, it's how we do the work. So let's build movements that don't break us, but sustain us. Thank you for tuning into today's episode. Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe, and we will see you in the next episode.
Bye.